New year, new conflict. Welcome to the 21st century. This time it appears the Venezuelan saga of whatever exactly they are pursuing is reaching its conclusion. The USS Gerald Ford is joining a massive naval buildup, and the war seems imminent. But there is one aircraft on the opposing side that could act as a deterrent long enough to search for a peaceful outcome, a jet that was absolutely sufficient when Venezuela acquired it in 2006, and a jet the West has feared for decades. The notorious flanker is the backbone of the Venezuelan Air Force. But in a clash against stealth fighters from the greatest navy in history, it offers anything but aesthetics that this aircraft could contribute. The Russian Su-30 comes in many variants, and they range between a late fourth-generation fighter and a monster worthy of respect. The protagonist of our story today, and the core of Venezuelan air defense and deterrence, lies somewhere in between, and it is called the Su-30 MK2V, but it was also known as the Su-30 MKV and the MK2V. And you are likely asking yourself, what exactly am I talking about here? Well, let me explain, because the Russians have a tendency to name Su-30 variants according to their customers. After the initial prototype series of heavily modernized Su-27 models and several iterations designed for export, the Russians developed the Su-30 MK, which stands for Modernized Commercial Variant, and the one that finally secured some valuable contracts. Thus came the Su-30 MK built for China, the MKI built for India, the MKM for Malaysia, and so on. Each of them has specific differences depending on what the end user wanted to integrate from avionics and weapons, or how the engines and airframe were altered. Since Vietnam also purchased the Su-30 from Russia, their version was called the MK2. The Venezuelans chose to designate their aircraft the MK2 AMV, where EMV represents the Venezuelan Air Force in Spanish. If you are not confused enough yet, the MK2 instead of the standard MK suffix came from the fact this aircraft was further modernized when compared to the base MK variant. Same meaning terminology change, but identical numbering. And here is the catch. China wanted its Su-30 to be specifically outfitted with anti-ship missiles and to specialize in maritime defense operations. As a result, an enhanced version of the MK was created to meet Chinese requirements, and it was also designated the Su-30 MK2. The Venezuelans like this concept as well, and since the primary threat to whatever they were pursuing comes from the north, and particularly from the sea, they decided to adopt this Chinese subvariant as their new multi-role aircraft, and thus the Venezuelan Su-30 MK2V, or AMV if you prefer, was finally born. The Venezuelan Su-30 does not feature thrust vectoring or canards like the Indian or Malaysian versions. Instead, much like the Chinese MK2, it was designed to focus on beyond visual range air combat and anti-ship missions. It is fitted with the N-01VP radar, a variant of the legacy Su-27 radar. But do not be mistaken, it is considerably more advanced. The VEP version introduces a SAR mode to scan and identify surface targets. The detection range was also significantly increased to over 100 kilometers for most targets and 150 kilometers for larger, slower targets in narrow beam modes. The radar antenna is massive and provides respectable look-down, shoot-down performance as well. Venezuelan aircraft are also equipped with L-150 RWR systems, allowing them to conduct SEAD missions by detecting and launching missiles against hostile radars once the antenna detects illumination. It is also fitted with Sorbcia ECM pods, which are somewhat outdated today, but still provide the pilot with basic electronic warfare capability. These systems again work alongside the RWR by attempting to jam the frequency used by the hostile radar emitter. But this aircraft is not all bark and no bite. The primary air-to-air weapons are the R-77 active radar-guided missiles and R-27 semi-active radar-guided missiles, which are somewhat outdated but still offer over 100 kilometers of range against large targets such as bombers or electronic warfare aircraft. This is solid, but the air-to-ground role is where the Su-30 truly excels. First of all, it is a two-seat aircraft with a pilot and a weapons systems officer, allowing one crew member to focus on targeting while the other concentrates on flying the aircraft. And then there is the fact that it can carry up to 8.5 tons of ordnance. Venezuela has acquired both the KH-31 and the KH-35, anti-radar and anti-ship missiles. However, the KH-31 can also function as an anti-ship missile once it locks onto radar emissions from a vessel. Because these weapons are ramjet-powered missiles, they travel at supersonic speeds and are extremely difficult to intercept. They can reach speeds of up to Mach 3, but their operational range is fairly limited by modern standards. Only about 70 kilometers for the air-launched version and roughly 120 kilometers for the P variant, which requires the aircraft to enter dangerous territory to launch. The Russians have upgraded versions known as the Kh-31AD and PD with approximately 30% increased range. But it is very unlikely they would supply Venezuela with such high-value munitions, especially while they are engaged in war. Yet in October, they did conduct patrols carrying live Kh-31 missiles off the Venezuelan coast, sharing images online and clearly sending a message to the United States. Venezuela also possesses standoff weapons such as the F-35 MK cruise missile. But these are designed for ground attack roles and they lack the MK or MK2 variants with active radar seekers intended for engaging naval targets. The Kh-29T is a TV-guided short to medium-range air-to-ground missile, and the KAB-500KR and TV-guided bombs are also available, but these would only be used during a ground invasion of Venezuela, which, considering American doctrine, would not occur without air superiority. Which brings us to the next question. Strategically, how would this aircraft perform against the very best the United States can field? Let us remove the elephant in the room immediately. The Su-30 MK2 cannot realistically challenge F-35s or Super Hornets. I mean, it might attempt, but it would not prevail. It could theoretically detect an F-35 using its infrared search and track system without activating radar, but at ranges where an AMRAAM would already be inbound after launch. United States Navy aircraft supported by Growlers and AWACS present an overwhelming force compared to only 21 Venezuelan Su-30s currently operational. However, if employed intelligently, they would avoid direct confrontation altogether. Venezuela benefits from having much of its land border with Colombia and Brazil, nations that would not permit U.S. combat operations from their airspace. This leaves only the northern approach to defend, allowing Venezuelan forces to reposition assets southward under the protection of their integrated air defense network. This is not some outdated pile of scrap either. Venezuela maintains a reasonably capable and layered air defense network, one that only platforms like the B-2 or F-35 could realistically penetrate without taking losses. Even then, such missions would be extremely costly and risky. More likely, the United States would rely on standoff options, such as cruise missiles and massive precision strikes to pressure Caracas into political change or to generate enough instability that internal unrest does the rest. That leaves only the possibility of a large surprise action for the Su-30 to play a real combat role, primarily against naval targets, thanks to its impressive combat radius of roughly 1,500 kilometers or 932 miles, allowing it to operate far from the coastline and threaten surface units. The human factor cannot be ignored either, namely the Venezuelan pilots and ground crews. A high-technology aircraft is only as effective as the people operating and maintaining it. By most reports, Venezuelan Su-30 pilots are competent, and some even received training in Russia when the aircraft were first delivered. However, economic hardship has almost certainly limited flight hours and advanced training. By contrast, U.S. Navy pilots fly significantly more hours annually and possess extensive combat and exercise experience. To offset this gap, Venezuelan pilots would have to rely heavily on home field knowledge and simpler tactics, such as ambushes, using terrain, radar coverage, and geography to their advantage, because against American forces, they simply lack comparable experience. Maintenance crews have reportedly kept the flanker fleet flying despite prolonged difficulties, but sustaining those Su-30s in wartime would be a struggle in itself. Every engine overhaul or radar malfunction would become a logistical nightmare without spare parts, making logistics the true Achilles heel of the Venezuelan Su-30 fleet, especially with Russia tied down in Ukraine. You may have a capable fighter in the ring, but if he is exhausted and unfed, he will not last long. The Su-30 is certainly not a miracle weapon that would turn the tide of a war. What it is, however, is a serious deterrent and a high-priority target for U.S. air and naval forces in the region. If conflict were to erupt, it is exactly the type of platform that would punish complacency. Once the flankers are dealt with, the U.S. Navy and Air Force would largely control the skies and could then focus on dismantling what remains of Venezuela's air defense systems. Still, One can only hope it never reaches that point. The world already has more than enough wars, and additional bloodshed serves no one. Perhaps Venezuela's leadership should try out these strategies in War Thunder instead of real life. If he becomes skilled enough, he can take his Su-30s to Moscow and dogfight online with Assad while letting his people live in peace.